January 17, 1940. A windowless room beneath the Reich main security office, Berlin. The air smells of burnt coffee and cigarette ash. Major Hans Thilo Schmidt leans over a wooden table scattered with intercepted Allied communications, fragments of words, half-decoded sequences, the skeletal remains of enemy secrets. Outside, snow blankets the city in silence. Inside, the hum of confidence. German cryptanalysts have already broken Polish ciphers, French diplomatic codes, even British naval transmissions. The Enigma machine sits in the corner like a mechanical prophet, its rotors spinning certainty into the future. Schmidt examines a freshly intercepted American diplomatic cable. Simple substitution, almost childlike in its construction. He permits himself a thin smile. The Americans, he notes in his log, remain cryptographic amateurs. It is a conclusion that will endure unchallenged for nearly 5 years. Across the Atlantic, in a nondescript office building on Constitution Avenue, a different kind of war is already being waged. No uniforms, no medals, just mathematicians with chalk-stained fingers and linguists who dream in foreign syntax. They work in silence, building machines that do not yet have names, solving problems the enemy does not yet know exist. But Berlin does not see them. Berlin is not looking. By the 1940, German intelligence had every reason to believe in its own supremacy. The Enigma machine, with its astronomical number of possible settings, over 150 trillion combinations, had rendered German military communications virtually impenetrable. The Abwehr, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, operated one of the most sophisticated espionage networks in Europe. German cryptanalysts had cracked the codes of nearly every major power they faced. Poland fell in weeks, France in 6. Britain, isolated and besieged, clung to survival by threads the Germans believed they could see and count. And then there was America, wealthy, isolated, industrially mighty, but militarily naive. A nation that had entered the First World War late and seemed reluctant to enter this one at all. To German intelligence, the United States was a logistical giant with the strategic subtlety of a freight train, formidable in production perhaps, but lacking the refined cruelty of European statecraft, lacking, above all, the discipline of secrecy. This was the assessment. American cryptography was a generation behind. Their diplomatic codes were breakable, often embarrassingly so. The State Department's strip cipher system used throughout the 1930s had been compromised repeatedly. The US military's M94 cipher device, a cylindrical contraption of rotating disks, was considered obsolete by European standards. Even the American Cigaba machine, which entered limited service in 1940, was dismissed by German analysts as mechanically interesting, but operationally irrelevant. After all, the Americans had no great need for cryptographic sophistication. They were not yet at war. They had no front lines, no occupied territories, no desperate need to whisper secrets across contested airwaves. They were safe, distant, and in the eyes of Berlin, complacent. But distance is not the same as absence, and complacency in this case was a mirage. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that American cryptography had never been about tradition. It was about pragmatism, improvisation, and the strange alchemy that occurs when you gather engineers, mathematicians, and puzzle solvers in the same room and tell them the survival of democracy depends on what they build next. The Americans did not inherit their cryptographic systems from centuries of European statecraft. They invented them, often from scratch, often in basements and borrowed offices, often by people whose names would never appear in history books. And they did so with a freedom of thought that rigid, hierarchical German intelligence could neither predict nor comprehend. In 1939, a team led by William Friedman, a geneticist turned cryptanalyst, began developing what would become the Cigaba machine. It was not elegant, it was not based on centuries of cryptologic theory, It was a beast of rotors and electrical circuits designed not to be beautiful, but to be unbreakable. And it was. Throughout the entire war, not a single Cigaba encrypted message was ever decrypted by Axis forces. Not one. The Germans, who had grown accustomed to reading enemy mail with the casual confidence of postmen, found themselves suddenly blind. But they did not realize it, because to realize it, they would have had to admit they had been wrong. And intelligence agencies do not easily admit to being wrong. The German expectation was rooted in experience. They had seen American codes before. They had broken them before. Why would this time be different? In 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the Abwehr and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht continued to intercept American communications with the same assumptions. They expected patterns. They expected exploitable weaknesses. They expected, above all, that the Americans would behave like Europeans, using codes born from history, tradition, and a certain aristocratic belief in the permanence of systems. But the Americans did not behave like Europeans, they behaved like Americans. They built machines that made no cryptographic sense by classical standards. They used random key generators. They embraced electromechanical complexity, not because it was refined, but because it worked. And they shared their systems across branches of the military and intelligence agencies with a fluidity that baffled the compartmentalized rigidity of the Wehrmacht. The symbolic object of this invisible war was not a weapon or a flag. It was the punch card. Thin, rectangular, perforated with precise patterns of holes, silent, unassuming, mass-produced. The punch card represented everything the Germans underestimated about America: industrial scalability, technological adaptability, and the willingness to treat information as a resource to be managed with the same efficiency as steel or oil. IBM punch card machines, initially designed for census data, were repurposed to analyze encrypted messages at speeds no human cryptanalyst could match. The Americans turned accounting into warfare. They turned logistics into intelligence. And the Germans, who had always believed that cryptography was an art practiced by brilliant individuals in shadowed rooms, never imagined it could be industrialized. By 1943, the gap had become a chasm. American codebreakers working under the Army's Signal Intelligence Service and the Navy's OP-20G were not only protecting their own communications, they were reading the enemy's. Japanese diplomatic codes broken by Friedman's team even before Pearl Harbor gave the U.S. strategic foresight that shaped the entire Pacific War. German naval codes, attacked in coordination with British efforts at Bletchley Park, unraveled the U-boat threat in the Atlantic. Yet Berlin continued to intercept American signals and assume they were impenetrable only because the Americans had nothing important to say. The irony was complete. The Germans could not break American codes, but they convinced themselves this was because American codes were unimportant, not because they were unbreakable. The transformation came slowly, bitterly, and far too late. In 1944, as the Allied invasion of Normandy unfolded with devastating precision, German intelligence began to suspect that their communications had been compromised. Reports from field commanders contradicted what headquarters believed. Allied forces seemed to anticipate German movements, exploit weaknesses before they were even recognized as such. Paranoia spread through the ranks. Had there been a traitor? A leak? The possibility that the Allies had broken Enigma was considered briefly, then dismissed. Enigma was mathematically unbreakable. The problem, German analysts concluded, must lie elsewhere: in human error, in careless radio discipline, in sabotage. Anything but the codes themselves. It was not until after the war, in the cold light of defeat, that German intelligence officers learned the full scope of their failure. Not only had the British broken Enigma at Bletchley Park, a feat achieved through captured machines, Polish intelligence, and the relentless genius of Alan Turing, But the Americans had built cryptographic systems that the Germans never even came close to cracking. The Cigaba machine remained a mystery to them until they were handed technical documents during post-war debriefings. The punch card systems that had automated American cryptanalysis were revelations of a different kind of war, one fought not with soldiers but with information, not with territory but with knowledge. The Germans had underestimated American cryptography because they had underestimated the American capacity to innovate outside the boundaries of tradition. They had mistaken lack of history for lack of capability. They had confused isolationism with ignorance, and in that misjudgment lay a deeper truth. The war against fascism was never only about tanks and bombers, about beaches stormed and cities liberated. It was also a war of ideas about who could adapt faster, think more freely, trust more widely. The Germans built their cryptographic systems on the assumption that secrecy was a matter of mechanical complexity and rigid control. The Americans built theirs on the assumption that secrecy was a matter of collaborative ingenuity and relentless iteration. One system was designed to be perfect, the other was designed to evolve. And evolution, in war as in nature, is the greater survival trait. There is a photograph taken in 1945 of a captured German cryptanalysis unit. The officers stand beside their equipment, Enigma machines, codebooks, stacks of intercepted messages. Their faces are blank, exhausted. In the background, an American soldier examines a Cigaba machine, its cover removed, its rotors exposed. He does not understand how it works. He does not need to. It is enough that it did. It is enough that while the Germans were reading yesterday's codes, the Americans were writing tomorrow's. The punch cards are long gone now, dissolved into archives and memory, but the lesson endures. Underestimation is not a failure of intelligence, it is a failure of imagination. The Germans looked at America and saw a nation without the scars of centuries, without the tragic sophistication of European power. They saw abundance, optimism, a kind of naivety. What they did not see was that these were not weaknesses, they were advantages. The Americans did not need to preserve old systems because they were not afraid to invent new ones. They did not need to guard ancient secrets because they were too busy creating modern ones. And in that restless, improvisational, fundamentally democratic approach to problem-solving lay a strength that no amount of cryptographic complexity could contain. The invisible war was won not in a single breakthrough, but in 1,000 quiet decisions, to trust mathematicians over generals, to embrace machines over tradition, to believe that the best defense of freedom was not secrecy alone, but the relentless creative intelligence of free people working together. The Germans never broke American codes, but more importantly, they never understood why they couldn't. And that failure of understanding, more than any single battle, was a harbinger of the outcome. In the end, the codes were not just about messages, they were about worldviews. One side believed that control, precision, and hierarchy would dominate. The other believed that innovation, collaboration, and adaptation would prevail. History chose the latter. And in the silent rooms where cryptanalysts worked, where punch cards hummed and rotors turned, the future was written, not in the language of conquest, but in the language of freedom, unbreakable, unseen, victorious.